We are now live and the recording has begun. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment here. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the welcome and open plenary session. I'm Kavya from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. The chat is disabled for this session, so please send any questions for the speakers through the Q&A function. Please note that the session today is recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message TF Kavya Rizal Q Design for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Harpreet Kaur. Harpreet, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Kavya. Good morning, everyone. My name is Harpreet Kaur. I'm a business and human rights specialist at the UNDP Asia Pacific and also host for your forum. The second United Nations South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights, co-organized by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the International Labour Organization, and the United Nations Development Programme. The South Asia Forum has truly brought together different agendas and organizations to strengthen the partnership architecture on business and human rights in South Asia. In addition to the co-organizers, 33 partner organizations have joined us in organizing the forum. We received an overwhelming response from the partners, and the 3-day forum had to be extended to 5 days to accommodate side sessions and pre-forum sessions. The forum contains a total of 41 sessions, producing 65 hours of content, co-developed by over 200 speakers and participants. The sessions have been divided primarily into thematic sessions and sessions dedicated to specific countries and stakeholders. The stakeholder sessions, which were organized yesterday, provided a safe space, a facilitated space, safe space, and enabled open discussion among peers. Moreover, the country sessions will discuss the progress made on business and human rights in specific countries so far and the challenges that lie ahead. We hope to develop a national mini roadmap at the end of each country session. We are delighted to be joined by over 1,200 participants, more women than men, from 54 countries. While the discussions will focus on South Asia, they will be truly informed by other regions, providing peer learning opportunities as well. In some ways, the scope and scale of this forum extends beyond South Asia. And this couldn't have been possible without participation from all of you. And to welcome you all, I would like to invite Professor Surya Deva, Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Surya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. A very good morning, good afternoon, or it could be late afternoon somewhere, so different parts of the world. So a very warm welcome on behalf of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. This is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to join this second UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. The idea of this forum was conceived in 2018. And as you may recall, some of you at least, we had the first forum in New Delhi in March 2019. That forum was organized by UNDP and the UN Working Group. And I'm very pleased that this time we have an additional partner in the form of ILO, and very pleased to see Dagmar Walter. I still remember the meeting that we had in the ILO office. So this forum is really remarkable evidence of how different actors can come together to shape a particular agenda. At the outset, I would also like to thank all the team members who have been working very hard for several weeks to pull this forum together in a very difficult and challenging environment because of the pandemic. So very much appreciated all of your assistance over the weeks and perhaps months. Now, in my remarks, I would like to focus on two aspects. I would like to briefly mention the South Asia's interaction with business and human rights agenda. And then I will talk about what we should be doing going forward. Now, if we look at the history of business and human rights, the interaction of South Asia to business and human rights is perhaps quite old. We can go at least as far as back British East India Company, which was operating in South Asia in many countries. And some of the things that the companies was doing at that particular point of time they would be considered as serious abuses of human rights in today's context. In more recent time, if we look at some critical case studies in the business and human rights field, whether it is the Bhopal gas disaster of 1984, or Rana Plaza, or Ali Enterprise fire, all these are prominent case studies, and unfortunately, many of these are from South Asia. So South Asia has been exposed to business and human rights much earlier, and it is very center of everything that has been happening around. South Asia is also home to 1/4 of the entire world population. So any progress in the field of business and human rights at the global scale is not possible unless we make progress in South Asia. And I think we should see that this forum and whatever we do throughout the year in South Asia in this particular context. We can also see signs of progress in South Asia. Last week, the government of Pakistan released the draft Nation Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And I would like to congratulate the government of Pakistan for taking this political commitment into action. And of course, earlier, Indian government released the zero draft. And last year, they released also the revised version of the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. I also see some progress in terms of awareness raising and discussion taking place in countries, other countries in South Asia like Nepal, Bangladesh, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. I think we should also not forget Bhutan and Afghanistan. And I will encourage all the partners to not leave any country behind in South Asia and work together to keep the momentum going forward. Despite these signs of progress, I think there are significant challenges that South Asia is facing. The inequality is rampant. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed those inequalities, including issues about gender inequality and gender-based violence. At the same time, we see a greater push to recover the economy, and that's why dilution of labor laws, environmental legislation. We also see the governments trying to privatize public services without adequate monitoring and oversight. We see significant issues in terms of democratic deficits, shrinking civic space, and attacks against human rights defenders. Migrant workers are struggling in particular. Informal economy is so big in South Asia that we need to deal with this heads on. And of course, we have the challenge posed by climate change. So I think these significant challenges means that we need to keep on working collectively to make a better future for all of us. How can we do that? How can we overcome these challenges? I will propose for our consideration that we can, I will modify Barack Obama's yes, we can, and I would like to pick the can, C-A-N. So I will suggest 3 elements going forward. C stands for cohesive action. So I think we need cohesive action on the part of the states and companies. Of course, businesses have an independent responsibility to respect human rights, but unless states, all the governments in South Asia act decisively, things cannot move. The government should not be looking at focusing on ease of doing business. Rather, the focus should be on ease of doing responsible business. Because without responsible business, merely business is going to perpetuate the challenges that we are witnessing, whether it's climate change or inequality or poverty, and we will not be able to achieve sustainable development goals. So the governments have to lead. They have to walk the talk. At the same time, companies have to take their responsibility to respect human rights more seriously. It should not be merely window dressing. They should not do any lobbying with the government which is inconsistent with the idea of respecting human rights. And finally, investors and consumers, they also have to take cohesive action. If we want a better world, investors and consumers have a role to play. Then the second word in my can is A. A is access to remedy. Despite all attempts to prevent abuses, it is quite possible and very likely that there will be adverse impact on the communities. We absolutely need access to remedy and corporate accountability, which is absolutely vital. The courts are cornerstone of access to remedies. but we should also pay greater attention to national human rights institutions. And I would remind indigenous institutions that we have in South Asia. For instance, how we can use Gram Panchayats in South Asia to address business and human rights issues, how they can address those grievances at the village level, at the early stage, rather than going to courts and NHRIs, which could be far away. We should also look at protecting the civil society groups, human rights defenders, and trade unions. Because in our report in 2017, we consider them as justice enablers. They enable access to remedy for victims. So if we do not protect trade unions, if we do not protect civil society and human rights defenders, I think we will not be able to make much progress. My last letter is N. N stands for Networks for Change, in my view. I think we need to create those networks, and this forum is a good example of how UN agencies can come together and network together to make a change. We also need the governments to come together in the South Asia to work together, and beyond South Asia. For instance, there are migrant workers in Middle East, so the governments in South Asia must be working together with the governments in the Middle Eastern Europe and other places. We also need trade unions and civil society organizations to work together in a network. We should not have this compartment of trade unions operating separately from CSOs. And at the same time, we need companies to work together. So let me conclude by saying that let us join together, let us work together and be part of this change in South Asia, a change which is people-centered, a change which is rights-based, a change which is climate and planet-friendly. Thank you very much. Back to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Surya, for highlighting the progress we have made so far, but also outlining the challenges that lies ahead. And more importantly, for giving us the CAN pathway to be able to make a change. And with that, I would like to invite Sudipto Mukherjee, the resident representative at the UNDP Bangladesh, to deliver the welcome remarks on behalf of the UNDP. Sudipto, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harpreet, and very good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is across the globe. Distinguished government representatives, members of civil society, representatives of businesses and trade unions, human rights duty bearers and defenders. I'm absolutely delighted to join Professor Surya Deva, who I had the opportunity to very briefly meet at the Delhi event in 2019, who is the Vice Chair of the UN's Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and my colleague Dagmar Walter of the International Labour Organization in welcoming you to the second South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. I'm speaking from Dhaka. Today here in Bangladesh is a very special day. Today we are actually beginning a 10-day celebration. It is the centenary of the father of the nation, the birth centenary of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who himself was a great champion of human rights. Last week, the world marked the first anniversary of WHO's official declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic. 12 months ago, with the overriding need for institutions and partners to prioritize responses to the health crisis, we took the difficult decision to cancel this regional annual event. This year, in 2021, the very fact that the forum is happening signals a shift of efforts towards building forward better. The onset of COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented conditions in terms of economic and social disruption. The lives of hundreds of millions of families around the world, including in South Asia, have turned completely upside down, with jobs lost, mounting debt, and income falling off a cliff edge. As a result, extreme poverty is rising for the first time in decades, and South Asia alone accounts for 1/3 of the world's population living in extreme poverty. Here in Bangladesh, we have a huge caseload of migrant workers. So, a country which has been dependent on large amounts of foreign remittances. Migrant workers have actually come back from their assignment stations with no future and no prospects of returning anytime soon. The pandemic has not only deepened pre-existing divides, vulnerabilities, and inequalities, it has also opened new fractures, including fault lines in human rights. Women minorities, persons with disabilities, older people, refugees, migrants, ethnic and linguistic minorities have been affected disproportionately. According to recent reports, the economic damage caused by the coronavirus has wiped out 81 million jobs across the Asia Pacific region this year, with women and young people disproportionately affected. Further, the regional jobs disparity is largely driven by South Asia, where the 2020 employment estimate is nearly 50 million jobs below the pre crisis baseline. Another corrosive and damaging feature of the pandemic has been the use of social media and online platforms to sow and disseminate fake news and misinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines in frequent disregard for science and public safety. While I believe steps should be taken to prevent such dangerous practices, for example, by regulating social media giants, we must be equally vigilant not to fall into the human rights trap of allowing measures which have the effect of limiting legitimate freedom of expression and stifling free speech and shrinking precious civic space. I also defer to Professor Suryadeva's comments on the same subject in his opening remarks. If we want to reverse these trends that have offset much of the pre-COVID progress made in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, we must commit ourselves to tackle this crisis head on and to do so together. And I again defer to Professor Suryadeva's remarks on CAN. Therefore, we call on businesses now and more than ever before to take a sustainable people-centered recovery path guided by the responsibilities as enshrined in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Countries in the region have seen firsthand what prioritizing business over rights means. We saw global fashion brands, and in particular in Bangladesh, which is one of the largest ready-made garments manufacturers, cancelling orders or shipments without payments, forcing factories to close, resulting in families rationing food or taking children out of school. We saw unfair employment termination of women and factory workers without any compensation. However, we have also seen examples of more enlightened approaches by global fashion brands, assuring suppliers in Bangladesh of payments for cancelled orders, donating funds to cover wages of furloughed factory workers, and helping young women and their families with emergency relief. We have seen government relief packages and stimulus packages expand assistance to enterprises so that they can retain workers or to include informal workers. This shows the power of all hands coming together to open, and I repeat, this shows the power of all hands coming together to open, not shut, doors of opportunity and well-being for all. Distinguished participants, as we contemplate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we should remember that the last major economic and social upheaval this region went through did not lead to systemic change. This time, we must recognize the pandemic as a watershed moment that requires states and corporations to change their modus operandi, to forge a new normal of an economy where growth and respect for human rights go hand in hand. I repeat that we take this opportunity and recognize the pandemic as a watershed moment that requires states and corporations to change the modus operandi to forge a new normal of an economy where growth and human rights and respect for human rights go hand in hand. This will put us in a better position not only to reverse the setbacks caused by the pandemic, but also to address other looming crises which will be discussed during this forum, such as the ongoing expansion of big tech and surveillance and its profound human rights impacts, the over-reliance on fossil fuels that requires us to kickstart a transition to a green economy, and the rising impact of businesses on increasing the intense and complex conflicts. I must mention here that UNDP's signature product, the Global Human Development Report 2020, has been different. It's called Human Development in the Age of Anthropocene, Anthropocene being the human age, where human beings themselves have become their own existential threat. And we must change the way we actually work in this planet. As the COVID-19 vaccine is being administered in countries in the region, all of us, including businesses, can inoculate themselves and ourselves against some of the worst effects of these and other crises by adhering to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Recovery gives us an opportunity to generate momentum for transformation. The program of this forum was designed to discuss how such transformation can be brought about at the sub-regional and at the country levels. While allocating ample time to analyze regional trends and explore regional solutions, for the first time, we have decided to include country-focused discussions. I look forward to the deliberations of these sessions that will generate mini roadmaps to the implementation of the UN guiding principles in the years to come. Just 10 years are left for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. This is the decade of action. And the decade ahead coincides with the second decade of implementation of the UNGPs, which turn 10 in June this year. There is no doubt that the success of the two agendas are very closely linked. The targets of the SDGs will not be reached unless we succeed in completing this fundamental mind shift in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the business sector for the well-being of society. And I was just, in a recent conversation, I was reminded that the head of Unilever globally says that there is nothing called corporate social responsibility. There are only irresponsible corporates. For this reason, UNDP is redoubling its commitment to support countries in South Asia to implement the standards contained in the UNGPs on business and human rights, with partners such as the International Labour Organization and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, who are both present here, and with support from the government, from CEDA and the EU. We will further expand our engagement with the private sector in the decades to come. As the UN Secretary General reaffirmed in his call to action, human rights are our bloodline. They connect us to one another as equals. They are the pathway to resolving tensions and forging lasting peace. They are the building blocks of a world of dignity and opportunity for all. May these words inspire all of us during these 3 days of forum discussions and beyond. Thank you very much. I wish you all very successful deliberations. Back to Harpreet. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sudipto, for highlighting the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on women, youth, and the migrant workers, and also asking us to come together with all hands open to a people-centered recovery path. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to invite Dagmar Walter, the ILO Director at ILO Decent Work Technical Support Team for South Asia and Country Office for India. Dagmar, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And esteemed government, employer and workers representatives, civil society, youth colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm good day to you all. It is indeed an honor for me to join Surya Deva and Sudipto Mukherjee in the opening session of the second UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, this time held in a virtual setting. I already had the pleasure of participating in the 2019 inaugural UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights held in New Delhi, India. That event brought together 200 participants representing over 90 organizations from 16 countries for fruitful discussion on what governments, employers, workers, civil society, and other actors could and should do to enhance observance and respect for human rights and labor rights in business operations in the region. And I must say, I already heard that we will beat, the attendance and representation at this virtual forum. Now, we do this in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and in accord with the principles contained in international labor standards and other ILO instruments, such as the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy. The latter directly speaks to businesses about what they can do to protect labor-related human rights. Its 2017 revision has provisions for due diligence in alignment with the UN guiding principles and has specific focus on meaningful consultation with potentially affected groups and relevant stakeholders, including workers' organizations, and promotion of freedom of association and collective bargaining. Now, building on the success of the inaugural UN South Asia Forum, we are now organizing the second edition. It is held, as we have heard, of course, and know, against the backdrop of tremendous challenges that COVID-19 has placed on countries all over the world. The crisis has affected foreign direct investment and trade worldwide and continues to impact negatively on enterprises of all sizes and on workers and their families. South Asia, as a major supply chain hub, has been especially hard hit. Factory closures, falling consumer demand, and supply chain bottlenecks continue to have ripple effects. Numerous multinational enterprises have had disruptions, and many are exploring ways to consolidate supply chains and or reshore production, with significant implications for this region. The crisis has exposed especially those in the lower tiers, where micro and small enterprises and informal workers are concentrated. The crisis has also put the spotlight on persisting decent work deficits in the region. Inadequate social protection left many displaced workers without any income support. Women are disproportionately affected in multiple ways. The impact of the pandemic threatens to undo some of the recent, although modest, progress towards gender equality. Young workers, who often work in sectors most impacted by the crisis, have been hardly affected as well, with a share in employment loss 3 to 18 times higher than their share in total employment. Migrant workers have faced issues in several countries, including being pushed to take unpaid leave, early termination of contracts, non-payment of work produced, personal documents held by employers, inadequate safety and health measures, and higher levels of harassment and violence. In order to tackle the economic and social impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, the ILO proposed a policy framework with 4 pillars. First, to stimulate the economy and employment, then to support enterprises, jobs and incomes, to protect workers in the workplace, and engage in social dialogue to jointly develop and implement solutions. Now, this framework is underpinned by international labor standards, which have been elaborated and adopted by the ILO tripartite constituents, governments, employers, and workers together, and which form part of human rights. They remain important benchmarks for companies seeking to respect workers' human rights and are instrumental as countries seek to recover and rebuild. Translation of the UN guiding principles into action in business operations and relations, regardless of size, ownership, sector, or country of operation, is essential for realizing and safeguarding the human rights of workers in South Asia. Principle 12 refers to the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, which encompass 8 ILO core conventions regarding freedom of association and rights to collective bargaining, non-discrimination and equal pay for equal work, and elimination of forced and child labor. Now, the latter one, we work also in a platform way through the SDG Alliance 8.7, also in this region where we have pathfinder countries. This calls, as we have heard, for a collective, not a one-sided government or worker or business response alone, but a collective national and global response. Strong labor market and governance institutions are essential and a key responsibility of governments. Informed interventions by workers' organizations are critical enablers. And the role of business is of utmost importance, considering that the management practices have a direct impact on the fundamental rights of the workers, as well as those in their supply chains. But the question is, how do we drive stakeholders to internalize and promote fundamental rights at work? Enforcement of national labor legislation and compliance with international standards is one element. A complementary and reinforcing element is recognition of the business case for human rights, specifically labor rights. ILO's work with businesses, in particular in South Asia, shows a strong correlation between productivity and working conditions. Our interventions in, for example, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan have proven this point. Of particular relevance to company managers and workers, the ILO Help Desk for Business provides guidance on how to better align business operations with international labor standards and build good industrial relations. It includes a section on COVID-19, which gathers practical ILO resources and tools, webinars, and relevant normative guidance. We have also provided and still do on-site coaching services to support the businesses, especially micro and small enterprises, to improve management practices and then adopt employee-centric approaches. It specifically supported more than 10,000 MSMEs with business continuity without compromising on working conditions or opting for retrenchment. And this service has benefited some 2 million workers in South Asia. Home-based production dominates some sectors in South Asia, and the informal economy is especially present in the lower tiers of supply chains in this region. They were the most affected due to COVID, and the ILO, in partnership with workers and employers organizations, reached out to them through capacity building programs to improve their access to social protection, training on COVID prevention measures, wage determination, and collective bargaining mechanisms. The South Asia region has a high dependence on migrant labor within country, intra and inter-region. ILO has been advocating for safe and informed labor migration and is working closely with recruitment agencies and employers to address the protection of migrant workers. Further, social dialogue and dispute resolution mechanisms are key to address labor rights. For example, the ILO facilitated the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, which was a 5-year legally binding agreement between brands and trade unions to ensure a safe working environment in our GM industry. Similarly, in India, ILO is currently providing technical assistance to its constituents who are engaged in the development of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. In Nepal, discussions are also in place on human rights guidelines, and the national focal point on business and human rights will be established soon. Further, developing skills and supporting countries to adapt to the digital economy and pathways for a just green transition of the economy will also be important for sustainability. Labor provisions in trade agreements, particularly amidst the impact of COVID-19 on workers in the region, can be an important tool as part of an integrated approach in which trade policies promote decent work, as called for in the ILO Centenary Declaration. It is my hope that despite the setbacks that the pandemic has brought about, governments and business remain committed to the realization of workers' human rights. And I feel that this forum is so timely and it provides an opportunity to gather all of us as actors for constructive discussion and to redouble our efforts. I am convinced that both speakers and participants will no doubt inspire and energize us to keep up the good work and to move forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to the continued deliberations and thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Dagmar, for your astute remarks, and among other things, highlighting the ILO's policy framework with 4 pillars, and also the engagement with workers, and the importance of the social dialogue for the change. Thank you very much. The regional forums will truly be successful. The regional forums will truly be successful if the voices of the right holders are heard, respected, and included. The South Asia Forum hopes to empower, amplify, and influence right holders' voices, realizing that these pathways are non-linear and interconnected, with a hope that the South Asia Forum strengthens the capacity of right holders to find right holders, to find strategic allies among power holders and duty bearers, and to promote collaboration within civil society to defend rights in an ever-shrinking civic space. With this spirit, the co-organizers are honored to invite Soumya Surbhi, Development Knowledge and Management Fellow at Forum Asia, to convey the voices from the ground. Surbhi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpreet. Hello, everyone. In South Asia, states have used COVID-19 as a pretext to infringe upon people's rights. There has been an increase in the use of fake news, abuse of security forces, arrests, detentions, killings, and increased abuses against the rights to freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association, including through expanded control over digital spaces. Human rights defenders in particular have faced increased reprisal due to denouncing business-related human rights violations and speaking up about injustices. Civil society representatives who have attended yesterday's Safe Space session have identified the following key recommendations for governments, businesses, the United Nations, and civil society actors. As duty bearers, South Asian governments need to take concrete steps on civil society's repeated recommendation of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the fulfillment of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Governments should ensure the space for civil society remains open through advocating for legislations that support HRDs and other vulnerable groups, including LGBTIQ communities and religious minorities. Governments must put a stop to the increasing criminalization of HRDs and its accompanying impunity. Furthermore, governments should take practical steps to implement the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. The alignment of national policies to internationally agreed standards should be assured for the enforcement of preventive and remedial measures in laws and policies. This should include developing a mandatory legal framework for businesses to abide by the guiding principles and strengthening corporate accountability by ensuring the liability of companies when they fail to conduct adequate human rights and environmental due diligence. The formulation of policies, including the revisions of legislation that are not aligned with the UNGPs, should be through genuine consultation among stakeholders. The enforcement of these policies should include monitoring mechanisms involving state, the private sector, and civil society organizations to assess compliance. A true commitment to these principles would also require an enabling environment that facilitates public participation and access to information. At the international level, South Asian governments should support the United Nations process on the elaboration of an international treaty to regulate transnational companies to respect and protect human rights as an essential commitment towards following the UNGPs. Businesses should implement the UNGPs by undertaking human rights and environmental due diligence through practice of ground truthing and engaging in genuine dialogue and public consultation with civil society and human rights defenders to prevent rights abuses. Businesses must do their part in ensuring access to remedy and justice for victims of rights violations and simultaneously ensure thorough investigation of allegations of violations that are efficient and effective. Ultimately, businesses should put the respect of human rights at the center of their business models. The United Nations must address the increasing clamping down on civil liberties, economic, social, and cultural rights, and overall rise in authoritative responses. The adverse human rights impact of business activities across the region must also be taken up and incorporated as core requirements for relevant UN agencies' projects and activities. The UN should engage in a coordinated effort to support the implementation of the UNGPs in the region and facilitate all resources needed to ensure effective participation of civil society. Civil society organizations must strengthen coordination at the regional level, given the common challenges we face. There is a need to link issues of human rights labor rights, and the environment to create a larger regional campaign to amplify the voices of isolated and localized movements. We, civil society, need to be aware of intersectionalities and complement each other's movements. In this way, as we strive to transcend the regional level, ardent international pressure could follow suit. The best practices, strategies, or approaches we, civil society organizations, discussed should be complemented by concrete action by duty bearers. May the second South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights result in urgently needed action benefiting the most vulnerable, marginalized, and oppressed in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Urbi. And with that, I would like to conclude the welcome session. Thank you, Surya, Sudipto, and Dagmar. We would take a 10 minutes break now and then move on to the opening plenary. Thank you, everyone. We will join back in 15 minutes.
Thank you all. We are now taking a 15-minute break until the next session, opening plenary, in the same Zoom room. For the next session, please stay in the same Zoom room. Thank you.
තාම පෙන්වන්නේ මේ විදිහට තමයි. ඉතින් දාලා තියෙන 10 මාර 11 මාර
Hello all. We'll be resuming with the opening plenary in just a few minutes now. Please be sure to stay in the same Zoom room for that session. Thank you.
Video on back.
I'll answer some, yes. You go ahead.
Welcome back, everyone. We would now start with the opening plenary, looking at the progress so far and the impact of COVID-19. 2019 was an year of unprecedented challenges for all of us. We heard from Sudipto, Dagmar, and Surya, and even Surabhi on how it impacted government, society, and businesses of all sorts. However, despite the pandemic, the government of Pakistan continued to live up to its commitment to develop a national action plan on business and human rights, and thus set an important step towards implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I would now invite Shireen Mazari, the Minister for Human Rights, Government of Pakistan, to deliver the keynote remarks. Unfortunately, Ms. Mazari could not join us today, but she conveyed her best regards through this video message. Kavya, could you please share the video?
Bismillah ar-Rahman Rahim. I congratulate the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and the International Labour Organization, the ILO, for organizing this much needed regional discussion. I also applaud all the participants in this forum who represent a variety of stakeholders, including civil society, business, trade unions, academics, national human rights organizations, and governments. All of you have come together for a shared purpose to place the protection of and respect for human rights at the heart of business activity. Not just South Asia, but the entire global community has faced the most immense economic and social challenges over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Supply chains have been severely disrupted while economic activity has plummeted. Millions have been pulled back into poverty, having lost their livelihoods, undoing decades of global progress. Vulnerable groups have been disproportionately impacted, including women, children, and workers in the informal sector. As we build back our economies, we all must strive to build back better. Human rights must not be an afterthought, but instead must be central to the resumption of business activity. As Minister of Human Rights in Pakistan, I am proud of the efforts Pakistan has taken in the protection of human rights in business activity, most recently through the development of a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Pakistan is well on track to being the first country in South Asia with a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. It is my hope that in addition to being a major milestone in the advancement of human rights in the country, our efforts may inspire other countries from around the region in also advancing the business and human rights agenda. We developed the National Action Plan through a thoroughly inclusive process, which included several multi-stakeholder consultations. We are incredibly pleased and encouraged by the high levels of interest and participation demonstrated at all our consultations, especially amongst women. Additionally, we have made the draft National Action Plan available online so that the public may provide further feedback and recommendations. I think we can be proud of this participatory National Action Plan development process, and I encourage other countries from the region to do the same. Recently, Pakistan also became the first country, not just in South Asia, but across the Asia-Pacific region, which has developed a national focal point for the promotion of the ILO's Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, also known as the MNE Declaration. This again highlights the importance Pakistan places on the promotion of responsible, sustainable, and socially inclusive work. Pakistan is committed to placing human rights at the forefront of business activity, and we must all utilize this forum as an opportunity to increase the responsibility and accountability of businesses across South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mazari. Congratulations to Pakistan for making commendable progress on the implementation of both the UNGPs as well as the ILO MNA Declaration. The coronavirus does not discriminate who it infects, but in societies as fragmented as South Asia, social conditions do indeed discriminate. The impacts are being felt far and wide. And as they say, many side effects are still to materialize. Moreover, the consequences of this pandemic will be unequal, disproportionately affecting the vulnerable if appropriate action is not taken. But the optimistic I'm also seeing the glass half full. Our lives before the COVID-19 pandemic, running on a fast speed, were brought to a standstill. It created chaos, but also gave us the luxury of time which we hadn't experienced in the longest time. We all were reminded of the old proverb, health is wealth, and the importance of human life and relationships we share. It almost urged us to treasure those. The symbiotic relationship does not exist only in our personal space, but also the way the businesses, society, and governments are dependent on each other. No one would make sustainable progress without others' development. In this session, we would assess the impact of COVID-19 and what progress have we made so far. And to discuss that, I would like to invite our esteemed panel, Rajiv Dubey, Principal Advisor, Mahindra & Mahindra, Chanda Thapa, Consulting with Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and Markan Anton, Joint Secretary, Free Trade Zones and General Service Employee Unions. Welcome the panelists here. If you could also keep your cameras on during the discussion. And for participants, if you have any questions, please do use the function of question and answer, and we would come back to the questions at the end of the discussion. Rajiv, I would start with you. How do you think has global pandemic impacted businesses in South Asia? Have they been able to ensure business continuity? And what effect did this have on workers, suppliers, and society at large? Rajiv, over to you.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. Well, the global pandemic has had an absolutely devastating impact on businesses in South Asia, with especially disastrous consequences for the most vulnerable in the ecosystem, which is the informal sector, both the small and micro businesses, as well as the informal workforce, especially migrant labor. Thousands of units have closed down, millions have lost their livelihood. And of course, all this is reflected in the macro indicators. There's negative GDP growth, there's huge unemployment. In addition to this, of course, is the humongous physical and mental health impact. But what it has brought to the forefront, and it's clear to all of us in business, is that business and economic survival and growth, both in terms of demand and supply, depends on three things. One, the interconnectedness of business, government, civil society, employers, workers, and in fact of people across socioeconomic levels. Two, the need for collaboration across the entire value chain, customers, suppliers, employees, government, communities. Three, the vital role of purpose, values, empathy, and trust in managing the economic fallout of such a crisis. Many employers have made huge efforts in the last 12 months to adapt to the pandemic, to try and ensure that businesses survive and the health and well-being of workers is protected. And in these turbulent times, employers have worked hard to be a trusted partner for governments and workers and communities, and to become a key source of information for them, and of course of collaborative action. Many businesses took early action to support suppliers and their workforces and worked with them to produce innovative solutions which were viable for all the parties concerned. But there is still a huge amount of work ahead of us. And although we see more and more preventive measures, testing regimes and vaccination, and there is hope on the horizon, COVID-19 will continue to deeply impact the way companies engage with customers, the way we organize work internally, and the way we interact with each other. The pandemic, of course, risks broadening the inequalities within societies and across nations, making the gulf wider between the haves and the have-nots. And part of that is through the difference in access to the preventive tools, including vaccination. And of course, I don't want to get into it. We know how unequal the distribution of vaccine and vaccination is. Now, this clearly applies to the large number of migrant workers from South Asia who work abroad. And they are particularly vulnerable and should have access to vaccination and other preventive measures. In the developed economies, we see more and more supply chain legislation developing. Switzerland has adopted legislation. In Germany, legislation is planned to be adopted before the summer break. And many European institutions are aiming for far-reaching legislation. It becomes clearer and clearer that responsible business conduct for our region is not just a nice-to-have tag, but will be crucial if we want to be competitive and we want to enter larger, more developed markets. However, let me also be clear that resilient and productive supply chains are not achieved only through mandatory due diligence legislation in Europe and America, but through efforts to increase the productivity of suppliers, to modernize and improve framework conditions, and to develop social protection systems. Last June, at the Asian Human Rights Conference, we stressed the need to address the root causes of the challenges we are facing, particularly the need to have better and more conducive policy frameworks for job creation, for entrepreneurship and skill development, to put much stronger emphasis on addressing the informal sector, and to create viable and sustainable social protection systems. Indeed, what we have seen is that even where financial support for workers was available, it was not always possible to distribute the money because workers could not be identified because they lacked identity documents. So the pandemic has underlined the urgent need to comprehensively address the underlying causes of the problems in our region. COVID-19 has highlighted clearly the need for collective action and partnership. The fact that a vaccine was developed in 10 months instead of 10 years is, of course, partly due to science and technology, but also equally because of the close cooperation between the private and the public sector across countries. We need to build on this partnership approach coming out of the crisis and to make economies and societies in our region more resilient. It is my fond hope that this conference will trigger further partnerships and collective action. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patient hearing.
Thanks, Rajiv, for highlighting some key issues, including the plight of migrant workers, the inequality, lack of access and affordability across the region, but then also the growing tide of mandatory human rights due diligence and the impact it would have on South Asia as well. We would come back to a couple of questions later. And for those who want to ask any question to Rajiv, please use the Q&A function. Chanda, I'm going to move on to you now. What do you think are the unique challenges faced by civil society in the context of COVID-19 response and recovery? How can we create a safer environment for human rights defenders in the sub-region? Chanda, the floor is yours. Chanda, you're still on mute. If you could unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Harpreet, and good morning to everyone. Thank you to all the organizers, especially Harpreet and Dr. Suryadeva, for giving me this opportunity to be a part of the opening plenary and share the voices of indigenous communities, which I represent. As we all know, and I think the former speakers also have already emphasized, that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the whole world. And when we talk about this pandemic, indigenous peoples, particularly indigenous women, elders, persons with disabilities, among them, the impact is much more severe and also disproportionate. So the impact of this global crisis is not only limited to health or the fear of being infected, but also on their socioeconomic conditions, including their mobility, livelihoods, income generation, and access to food. When we talk about indigenous peoples, I think it's, and then business and human rights, then lands, I think it comes on the foremost for the indigenous peoples. So it's land is not only the commodity for indigenous peoples, but also has a very profound spiritual connection. The indigenous lands are always rich in natural resources, and they are always considered to be valuable for business operations. So, and the extraction and exploitations of natural resources is always the key focus of this neoliberal political economy. Hence, land grabbing, displacement, dispossession have been happening in most of the indigenous communities in Asia for the operation of mega projects, dams, including extraction of resources. So this has very much generated serious challenges to indigenous peoples. So the impact of such projects includes the loss of sovereignty, environmental degradation, damage to ancestral lands, loss of culture, indigenous knowledge, and livelihoods, often resulting in conflict and further marginalization of the community. So assessing this almost like, 2 years to 1 year, more than 1 year, situation of COVID, we see that the human rights situation has worsened during this COVID period. Many of the indigenous leaders and organizations, for example, in Bangladesh, have reported that the land grabbing and mining operations are continued without the consent of the affected communities. And the lockdowns in these countries have also led the indigenous communities more vulnerable to losing their land. And we have seen, I think, like so many reports are coming up that some Asian governments are
Chanda, I think your screen is frozen. Maybe if you could try reconnecting. Apologies, everyone. It looks like Chanda has internet connectivity issues. Maybe we will wait for 30 seconds. Otherwise, we'll move on to Marcus until Chanda joins back. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Chanda, looks like you're back. Can you please unmute yourself? Apologies, everyone. Maybe we will wait for Chanda to come back. And while we are waiting, we would move on to Ant and Marcus. Marcus, my question to you would be, what do you think has been the impact of pro-investment economy on your constituencies? How has this impacted workers' rights and trade unions, and what can be done about it? Over to you, Anton.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, especially to thanks for the UN Human Rights Working Group and the ILO. In my experience, I think the earlier speakers mentioned about the impact of the whole society. So I don't want to repeat, because I think not only the global South, even the global North have experienced the similar impact. In our experiences in Sri Lanka, you know what the significant development is. This is the first time the whole stakeholders understood how important of the global supply chain, because we know that a lot of people talk about the global supply chain, but they did not understood the significance of the global supply chain, and to ensure the transparent global supply chain on respect the rights of the workers at the global supply chain. So I think this is an eye-opener for all the stakeholders to understand, to ensure the human rights based on supply chain, which based on the human rights, especially to the all the sectors of the global supply chain. And the other thing is, we found that even the first reaction from the unions in Sri Lanka was that even the employers and the unions and the governments, either party cannot face this challenge alone. We have to come together. And that is how we were able to set up a tripartite task force to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic issues. The first thing we were able to achieve is to get the agreement from the government that no single employee will be out of employment because of the pandemic. So I think this tripartism has helped us to minimize the damage, especially the loss of employment. Of course, there are loss of employment, because we found that not all the employees, but some employers try to misuse this tripartism. But by and large, we can say that because of our tripartite negotiations has helped us to minimize the job losses. And in our experience is that I think all the stakeholders has to understand that the real and genuine tripartism can be achieved when there is a strong bipartite negotiations at the plant level. That is the thing we have to understand, and that is what we have to achieve. Because what still we found that the suppliers and the employers are very much like to have a tripartite negotiation at national level, but they are reluctant to develop a bipartite negotiation at plant level. I think that is the issue we have to address, because we believe that when there is a real and genuine bipartisan at the plant level, it's really develop a satisfactory workforce as well as satisfactory employers. And in the other aspect, I want to raise this issue. It is what is the role of the brands, buyers, and retailers, because they are also part of this whole situation, especially this pandemic has, giving lessons to us to understand this whole supply chain is work not only the national level, but in the global level. The brands, suppliers, and retailers can play a major role. So we need alliance of stakeholders, including brands and buyers and civil society organizations. And that type of broader alliance is needed for us to bring forward to the achievement we were achieved during this period. And so I think that is my experience during this intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus, for highlighting the transparency of global supply chains, but then also the role of brands and retailers, highlighting unfair purchasing practices can end up perpetuating unsafe work conditions. I also hear the call for collaboration, both from you as well as Rajiv, and I hope in the discussion today we can also think about how we can collaborate among the different stakeholders. I see Chanda is back. Sorry, Chanda, we lost you in between. Could you can resume from where you left. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harpreet, and my sincere apology. I think I got disconnected. Yeah, I think I was talking about this whole situation, that how land is connected to the human rights of indigenous peoples. And then because during this COVID situation also, the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples, especially the rights to land, territories, and resources have been impacted. So I think in most of the Asian countries that we have been listening to, and then we have been experiencing that the land grabbing, displacement, disposition have been happening in most of the indigenous communities, and for the operation of mega projects, dams, and extraction of resources. So this has very much contributed towards marginalization of the indigenous communities, local communities. So during this COVID period, I think we have experienced, as I think former speakers have also emphasized, the human rights situation has worsened in the context of South Asia, also many of the countries in South Asia also. So we have been experiencing the cases in Bangladesh, where there are number of land grabbing cases are happening, and also the mining operations are being continued without the consent of the affected communities. So the lockdown situation has further increased the vulnerability to lose their land. And in many of the countries, we are also experiencing that the governments are taking this situation, this crisis, as an opportunity to introduce regressive policies and laws that is also further violating the rights of indigenous peoples. And so far the human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, have been facing this criminalization, threatening, repressions, and especially by the security forces in many of the countries, including Nepal, Bangladesh, India. So but despite this situation also, they are quite on the forefront in the resistance movement. against the government, against the businesses, and this has also resulted to face, like number of like harassment. The human rights defenders are facing harassment, attacks, disappearance, and killings. I think the recent example we can see the arbitrary detention of Hidme Markham from Chhattisgarh, who is leading the anti-mining campaign in India. Which was focused on the projects led by large corporations such as Adani Private Limited, and which has allegedly threatened to destroy the sacred Adivasi Hill. So, I mean, like once you are into this kind of movements, then I think the consequences can be very, very severe that our human rights defenders are facing. So as the guiding principles call on businesses to ensure at a minimum that regardless on the size, location, and type of project, their activities adhere to those rights contained in the International Bill of Rights and the International Labour Organization's core conventions. And moreover, the corporation should comply with the additional requirements under ILO 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this core principle that I'll also share later, the free, prior, and informed consent. But I think in most of the cases, most of the countries, this is not happening. Especially I'm referring to South Asia as well. While businesses are considered as driving force of development, economic growth, it is also played a very, contributing role for the crises such as like climate crisis, biodiversity, human rights crisis. So the human rights violation has really intensified in many of the South Asian countries. And the lockdown and this COVID has, made this much more difficult for people, those who are into these campaigns or like resistance, movement. It has made it much more difficult. So as I'm not officially representing, but like IIBP has been coming up with a number of reports, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. So as per the report, like in India, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is rolling back the environmental protections through multiple means. In March 2020, last year, the draft EIA notification was released, which exempts certain categories of industries from needing EIAs. So I think this will have very severe implications and for both human rights and in the environment. So in the context of Bangladesh, in the Bandarban Hill district of CST, indigenous Jumma villagers had 5,000 acres of rubber plantations, which was burned by the land grabbers with some political affiliation and the legal occupation of the community, Jum lands in the CST that has, accelerated in the midst of, COVID-19 crisis. So that means the indigenous communities who are holding, land, their ancestral land have been, grabbed for different purpose. So that means that the human rights violation were happening, but during COVID situation also it has been increased. So at the same time, the indigenous Moro communities in Bangladesh, Bandarban themselves, are also facing the eviction from their ancestral land, as well as human rights violation due to the construction of luxuries, this hotel and tourism facilities, that also seriously violates the international human rights standards, including UN principle of guiding, principle of business and human rights. So these are some of the examples. And then let me go to Nepal, I think.
Chanda, also if you could wrap up in 30 seconds so that we can move on to the next session,
yes.
Please.
So I think these kind of situations are making the communities much more difficult. While the campaigns are going on, it's also much more challenging for the communities to resist against the state or to the powerful business, like companies or like very influential people who are involved in this process. But as I think Dr. Surya Deva also mentioned that we all have experienced the civic space is shrinking day by day, making the human rights defenders' lives more challenging and riskier. So, and this COVID situation, like neither the government nor the public were like very much prepared, like how to really respond. I mean, that's why there are lots of loopholes from, like different sides. But despite these challenges also, like the indigenous communities or communities at large, I think they are building the solidarity. And there's becoming a support system to each other, like becoming a safety net for each other. So Yeah, I think the different kind of, like the local initiatives reviving their old age rituals, traditional customary practices, like the by the community is a way of, like supporting the communities at the time of this crisis. So I'll just end here now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chanda, and also Rajiv and Marcus for highlighting the challenges of COVID-19 and the adverse impacts of COVID-19. As I said in the beginning, the optimist I am. So I'm looking at the half glass full. And with that, we would move on to the next section of this opening plenary. What do you think are the positive business and human rights developments that you have observed relating to your stakeholders group in the recent years? And how can we build on that? This is a question to all the three panelists. And could you please keep your remarks to 3 minutes? Marcus, if we could start with you, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned in my initial intervention, one of the positive thing is to all the stakeholders have understood that how important to ensure the the global supply chain which respect each other as well as they respect the human rights of the employees. So that's the lesson I think we learned from this COVID-19. And at the same time, I think the global supply chain has given us all the stakeholders to, take up their issues globally. But unfortunately, we feel that sometimes when we take up these issues globally, because we feel that the global stakeholders also have a responsibility, sometimes the governments are thinking that we work against the national interest. I think that should not be the way to handle this situation. I think we have a right to raise issues when we found that these issues are globally handled, and therefore these are the things we should think about how we can resolve. If there is a national mechanism to resolve nationally, in fact, no one want to take these matters into the globally. So therefore, there is a need at national level to handle to find solution within the national context. And then if there is no way, then we have a right to take up these matters globally. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, very important aspect as a union and as a workers is to ensure the plant level bipartite negotiations, because we feel that the bipartite negotiation means the employers has to talk to their own workers and to listen to their voice. Because when it comes to the pandemic, I think how to prevent this pandemic, there should be a dialogue between the workers and the employer. And then because we feel that this pandemic is not a, what do you call this, occupational health and safety issue. It is a pandemic issue. So pandemic is to handle not only within the factory, the measures has to be taken not only within the factory, even outside, even the transport, how to arrange the transport, and the boarding house issue, because we had a very serious issue, how we know that how workers were chased out from the boarding houses they were living, because the owners of the boarding houses did not understand what is the real situation. So therefore, there should be a very unique system which ILO has always propagated, that bipartite negotiation at plant level is the most important thing to overcome, because that will give us a satisfactory workforce. That means when you have a satisfactory workforce, you will get the improvement of productivity, and your company will get the very good image. So that is the way we believe that we should address this issue.
Thank you, Marcus. And then now we would move on to Chanda. And if you can keep it within the 3 minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Harpreet. I think in terms of the positive, side, I think we can look into this, some of the incidents that has also given some hope. Like, of course, the businesses should be responsible to avoid, like causing or contributing to human rights impacts, but also seek to prevent or mitigate those impacts. But there are also some of, I think, so the what is it called, the human rights approach, which is a turning principle into effective policies. But we are having some, like challenges in terms of putting those human rights based approach into practice. So at the same time, I think there are also some issues related to like building consensus over these standards. What do you mean by standards? Like, for example, there is not a consensus how companies should approach countries with broad human rights violations. So I think, but at the same time, I think we can also see some positive sides. Some companies have like chosen not to operate, for example, in Myanmar due to the government's human rights policies. So I think this is also some kind of accountability the companies are taking. I think this is something we can really appreciate. At the same time, I think some of the stakeholders are also, they have also called upon companies to use their, like influence to seek greater respect for human rights. So this means that there is collective effort from multiple stakeholders to ensure that the due diligence or the human rights based approach are also integrated in these processes. At the same time, I think the organization like International Finance Corporation, like has recognized all kinds of heightened risk that defenders are facing during the pandemic. So that's why they are also, like acknowledging these things and then getting more, like engaged for the, like advocating human rights based approach. So these are some of the positive sides that different stakeholders are coming together to, like support this process. I think we also see, like, because of different, like civil society organization, UN agencies, and these kind of forums are also helping to build the, like increase the understanding of human rights and the business rights, the whole concept, and how it has been, the violations are happening at the ground level. And there is an increased collective efforts, like within the communities on the ground, and also from different external stakeholders like international organizations, UN agencies, like so on. And I think we can also see, like social media, they're being like playing like important role in the context, whether it's for disseminating information, like through campaigns, organizing campaigns, and then all those things. And as per our experience, I think we are also seeing like more engagement of the young people, like in the movement and campaigns. Another one before I end, I think the voluntary corporate social responsibility, I think we need to definitely strengthen it, like from a human rights based approach, integrating human rights based approach. But I think this is one like approach or like a very suitable method to ensure business compliance with the human rights standards. So I think these things should be, like more businesses also coming up with more, openly to comply, like the due diligence. And finally, I think minister from honorable minister from Pakistan also shared that they have already drafted the national plan of action, and then also very encouraging that her emphasis was on participatory process. So I think so far in Asia, Thailand and Japan have developed the national action plan, and India is also in the process. So hopefully the other countries will also start the process of developing the NAP, and more engagement of CSOs in the consultation process, but not only engaging in the consultation process, but also integrating the inputs, the feedback from the constituencies, which is very important for developing this national action plan. So yeah, I'll just end here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chanda. And also, Pakistan is perhaps the first national action plan that does have a chapter on COVID-19. So I think it is also sort of set an example of how governments can address to the issues that as they arise in their national action plans. Rajiv, I'm going to move on to you with your 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I see a growing realization among corporates that you cannot have sustained profit unless, in addition to business factors, you also address people and planet. So commitment to the triple bottom line. The second is that in order to have sustained business performance, you need to have trust among all stakeholders. And this trust is based on dialogue, on listening, on mutual respect. And that is becoming critical for business outperformance. And the foundation for this is really respecting human rights. And I see in 3 areas a fair amount of things happening. One is creating decent working conditions, especially OSH and fair wages and social protection. I see that. I see growing concern and action on gender and other forms of discrimination in the workplace. And of course, I see work on the abolition of child and forced labor. So these are the areas that I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajiv. I also see there are a couple of questions that are emerging on the question and answer. And maybe if we can move on to some of the questions here. And Rishi, I'm going to pick up your question first. In India, problem of migrant workers and informal workers is nothing new. It's unfortunate that a pandemic like C-19 had to highlight these issues. I would like to learn how businesses can stop reacting to situations and start collaborate with other players. I also realize Professor Suradeva and Dagmar Walter are still online and may also want to address some of the questions that are being raised here. But Rajiv, if you can respond to this question from Rajiv.
Yeah.
And if any other panelists would like to come as well. Rajiv, the floor is yours.
So I agree with her that they've been around for a long time, but what the COVID-19 did was it showed critically how both demand and supply are vitally dependent on taking care of the migrant labor and the informal workforce. So it highlighted the need and forced many of us to actually start looking at it. And sometimes it needs a crisis to galvanize action. So this is the reason why I think COVID-19 has resulted in a focus, because it brought about the business importance. We were taking them for granted.
Thanks, Rajiv. If any of the other panelists would like to respond as well.
Yeah, I think the importance of the social security system is a very, very, one of the important lessons from the pandemic, because we know that most of the Asian countries, we don't have the social security system because many workers lost their employment. There is no unemployment benefit scheme. And I think this is the time where we have to come together and discuss the possibility of develop a social security system and unemployment employment scheme, which covered all the sectors. It includes informal sector and the migrant workers. That's another lesson we have learned.
Thanks, Marcus. I'm going to now move on to the next question, which is what can be done to allude to vaccine companies to ensure that countries in Global South and South Asia will have access to COVID vaccines? Is there a business case for human rights? Is the business case for human rights hollow? I understand Surya Deva is still online. Surya, if I could pose this question to you. Also, for those who are interested, there is a session on access to vaccines later today. So please tune in at I think it's at 14, it's at 2 o'clock India time, but we would update it soon.
Thanks, Harpreet, for the question. I think the COVID crisis has shown that there are unprecedented amount of inequalities in society. And I think COVID has exposed those inequalities. So when it comes to vaccination, of course, as Rajiv highlighted, the public-private partnerships, including with universities, they have really pushed and fast-paced the development of vaccines. That is remarkable. But at the same time, the key issue is about access and affordability of this vaccine, because they may perpetuate further discrimination. For instance, if in future, vaccination becomes a critical component before one can travel, then the access is going to bite harder those people who do not have access to vaccines. So I think, again, governments and businesses would have to work together under international frameworks, because we are talking about right to health here, right? Which is a non-negotiable fundamental human right. So states have obligations. So states must ensure that people have access to vaccine and whatever else is needed to overcome the pandemic. At the same time, states alone cannot do it. So businesses have to pull in their expertise and resources, and other foundations have to come together. Let me add a footnote about the business case. I think we can continue this debate endlessly, but I always believe that human rights must not be linked with business case. Business case should not be the foundation to respect human rights. If there is a business case, that is an additional reason for businesses to respect human rights. But business case must not be the reason for businesses to respect human rights. I think I would like to add that clarification, because people confuse these two factors. Human rights are non-negotiable, normative preconditions for doing business, period. Whether there is a business case or not, businesses must respect them. If there's a business case, better, right? And I would say here the governments must step in and they should make a business case. And they could make that business case by providing incentive to companies which are respecting human rights and targeting businesses who are free riders and not taking human rights seriously. Then the business case will become real, but it is not there now. Thank you.
Can I butt in for a second?
Yes, Rajiv,
I
please.
resonate with what Surya just said. But I also want to say that even without, it's difficult to convince people always on the philosophical and the moral part of why something should be done. It is very important. I totally agree with you. But if somebody could actually get numbers, and I think it is possible, and I think there are enough cases, but we just don't have the evidence, then people will realize that even if they don't want to worry, or even if they're not concerned about purpose and values, the sheer business case exists. And Surya, if the United Nations or the ILO could actually generate the evidence for a business case, it would go a long, long way in making human rights come quicker and faster. I think that's the point.
I see where this discussion is going. And before Surya, I see, you perhaps want to respond, but if I may add another question from a participant here, and then I'll hand it over to both you and Rajiv again. Considering that time is running out to achieve the SDGs, and we are entering the second decade of implementation of the UNGPs, how can we prevent companies from lobbying against public interest, corporate capture, as we say? How do we disrupt existing power structures? Surya, Rajiv, any of you, if you would like to answer. Also, a small note that we do have a session on the next decade of action connecting UNGPs with SDGs starting at 12 o'clock India time. So please tune in later.
I can very briefly react to this and then pass it to Rajiv. So I think corporate capture is problematic because it creates incoherence in what businesses are promising to do and what they are doing. So I would say lobbying inherently is not problematic, but a lobbying which is opaque, non-transparent, and which is against the public interest is problematic. So if businesses are lobbying the government that dilute the environmental legislation because we need to revive the economy, or let the coal projects continue because fossil fuel is very good. At the same time, same companies say, oh, we support the climate mitigation efforts. So I think we see this lot of incoherence in that. And if political capture, so the corporate capture of the state is resulting in corruption, that is problematic. Lack of transparency is there. Certain companies are getting government deals and licenses because they have given donations to certain political parties. That is highly problematic. So it undermines the whole idea of rule of law and democracy in the largest scale. So I think, and I think increasingly in the business and human rights space, there is a greater focus on this coherence that businesses should do really think what are they lobbying for and against. I think that has to be really taken into account. Rajiv, if you might come back to your earlier suggestion about the collecting this evidence about the business case. I mean, the scholars in the management schools have been trying to do that for many, many decades. Whether there is a conclusive evidence for business case, and the studies are inconclusive. So there are studies indicating that there is a business case for gender equality, for instance, or not polluting the environment, and so on and so forth. And some studies indicating that there is none. And my suggestion is that it is almost impossible to find a universal business case that works for every company in every situation. It is impossible. So the difficulty is we should not fall into this trap of slippery slope that businesses should respect because of the business case. Of course, if there's a business case, they should do it. They're greater regions. But the point is, this is the starting point. This is the non-negotiable thing. Businesses have a license from society. They don't have the license to make profit by abusing human rights. Let me put it this way. The license is conditional on respecting human rights. And whatever way you would like to frame it in terms of values and purpose and business case, I'm fine with it. But for me, that is the starting point. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. Rajiv, you've literally got 30 seconds to respond because I see there are lots of other questions which I would want to pose to Marcus and Chanda as well. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with Surya.
That was great. 5 seconds respond. Surya, you've convinced a business C right here. With that, I'm going to move on to the next question. And Marcus, this is a question to you. Is the presence of workers, institutions, or unions and the right to freedom of association a necessity for genuine bipartite talks between employers and workers? Marcus, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, this poses the question of human rights of guaranteed to the workers, because for instance, the freedom of association is a fundamental right. And so we feel that, to respect the freedom of association and the human rights is the way out to the business, because as I mentioned earlier, the voice has to be heard from the workers, and they should be part of the, business planning and as well as the production process. And if the employers are willing to hear their voices, that can be the most successful way out to the business, community. But unfortunately, what we found is that sometimes the situation is getting other way, because the decisions has been taken somewhere else and to impose the workers to carry out. So that is not the way we feel that, especially the business can be continued with there is a very strong and genuine relationship between the employers and the employees. That can be achieved only way to respect by law and by practice allowing the workers to have a freedom of association and collectively bargaining. That is the only way out, we think, as a union.
Thank you, Marcus. I see there are lots of other questions coming up on the Q&A function. However, we don't have that much time to respond to all the questions. Please note that there are additional sessions at the forum, and many of these questions could be answered in the discussions going forward. Naveed, I see a comment from you also in the context of not having a dedicated session on Afghanistan. I'm sorry, the organizers really didn't have the capacity to organize the country sessions for all the countries in South Asia, but that's a suggestion that we would take forward. Also, even though there isn't a specific country session on Afghanistan, you are welcome to join any of the country sessions that you may want to join. The country sessions are open to all the participants, and you can choose whichever country sessions you want to join. And also these are run exclusive, and there are no parallel sessions at the same time. That provides you actually the opportunity to also be able to engage and participate in all the country sessions. So, and your suggestions are very well taken off. I'm gonna now move on to the final concluding remarks. I wish we had more time, but we've only about 8 minutes from the session before the session ends. And this is a question actually to Rajiv, Marcus, Chanda, but then also to you, Surya, in that series. If you could influence one thing in the next decade to promote business respect for human rights in South Asia, what would that be? Rajiv, we could start with you, please.
Yes, I'm showing a red rag to Surya, but it would be to make people be aware that they cannot do business on a sustained basis unless they respect human rights. From a purely productivity, innovation point of view, of course, philosophically and morally, but purely from a business point of view, it's not possible to do good business unless you respect human rights.
Thank you, Rajiv. Chanda, the floor is yours.
Sorry.
Chanda, do we have you?
Can you see? Oh, okay.
We can hear you.
I think, yeah. I think this whole word influence is very challenging for like the communities like indigenous peoples. But I think what I would say is it's very important for the indigenous communities to have the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, which is key, and it has come up as a lifeline for indigenous people. So, and in this context also, I think just emphasizing it's the consent and not limited to consultation. So I think as an indigenous, as an activist, I think that will be something advocating, like all the processes, including these kind of forums for the FPIC to be integrated in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Chanda. And Marcus?
Yeah, I think in our experience, we believe that the future is how we strong at national level as a social partners, and the social partners has to come together. So in the same time, each and every social partner should respect each other and to allow them to develop their own way. And the same time, we should develop a broader alliance, between the unions and the civil society organizations who are really think about the future of the society. And the same time, the brands and the retailers and the buyers also have a responsibility to, to see that all their stakeholders will respect, and, especially their suppliers will respect the human rights at plant level. Thank you.
Is this my turn, Harpreet?
Apologies all. Looks like Harpreet was just disconnected. Surya,
all right, so probably I can then abuse this and start, because I understand she wanted me to speak. So I think I agree with what the other panelists, Rajiv, Anton, and Chanda have mentioned. So I think there is no disagreement on that. Harpreet, I think you are back. So should I continue?
Yes, please. Sorry, we've had a bit of an internet issue here.
No problem. Thank you. So I think, Harpreet, I would just say 2 points. One is that I will put my energy in asking everyone, which is states, companies, and each one of us individually, to take human rights seriously. Because if all of us can take human rights seriously, I think we will definitely create a better world. And I think the second point I would like to mention is that we need to govern not for the top 2% of the pyramid. I think the business and human rights discourse in the next decade has to govern for the entire population. Otherwise, the current levels of inequality that we see are going to become worse, and this will not be sustainable. Going back to Rajiv's point, if you look at the difference in wages between the corporate executives and a typical worker, it is sometimes more than 500 times. This is unsustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, and thank you everyone for the final concluding remarks. This session ends here today, but we hope that you're able to join us in the sessions hereafter. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye for now.